ecclesia in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3. We're going to do a brief update on my research in pre-tribulation rapture passages in the early church fathers. Tommy particularly asked for this, and I thought, you know what, this is a really good idea. So let's get started on these patristic passages. And some of the highlights you can see up here that I've come across in the last year. I found 6 more pre-tribulation rapture passages in the writing of Eusebius that were unknown prior to that to the pre-tribulation, premillennial students and scholars. Now, if you don't know who Eusebius was, he was a church father in the 4th century. He was a well-known scholar. He was amillennial, and he followed the allegorical method. We're going to examine 2 of his passages that we did not look at last year. And Eusebius is very unique because he's another classic example that there were early church fathers that were amillennial and pre-tribulational. And I just want to put in a plug for this. If any of you guys out there are working on a PhD or thinking of going on a PhD project, consider taking up the fact that there were early church fathers that were amillennial and pre-tribulational. You would be doing a dissertation on a subject that's brand new, uncharted territory. Now, I also found a potential resolution to what I call the Irenaeus conundrum. Some people look at apparent pre-tribulation rapture passages in Irenaeus, and they think that Irenaeus was pre-tribulational, and others say nope, in 526:1 he's got a post-trib passage, so he's probably post-trib. And I've discovered material in reading through Irenaeus, both in the Greek and in the English, that there's a way to resolve this and defend his pre-tribulation status. And we're going to look at that. And then I found very strong opposition to the pre-tribulation rapture in Macarius, who was a Coptic monk in the 4th century. And we're going to examine his treatment of 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 18. So let's start with the Eusebius passage, which is found in his fragments on Luke 18, verses 1 through 8. And there we read, "The saying, 'When the Son of Man comes, shall he find faith on earth?' reveals a lapse of faith when no faithful man shall be found, or perhaps somewhere a few scarce ones in the time of his second coming. For the world shall meet with the great test in the season of apostasy, in which the faithful man will scarcely be found. Suddenly there shall not be even one, because some have been taken and the others left behind, delivered to the eagles."
Left behind?
That's right.
Yeah, we do a book series on that.
Yeah, wouldn't that be cool? We'll have to get someone to do that. "In this way," notice that phrase, "in this way, there shall be a lapse of faith amongst mankind. Thereafter he shall take revenge for his saints, which have been killed by the ungodly." So notice the order here. First of all, there's a sudden snatching that takes people away and leaves the ungodly. And this is what causes the great lapse of faith on earth. All the godly are taken, and only the ungodly are left, and that just leads to an insane degree of apostasy. We have another Eusebius passage in the general elementary introduction on point 31. Very fascinating understanding here. "When he has finished his spiritual temple of rational and soulish stones, that is, his church, the Lord himself shall come, even the God-word, and with him the angel of the covenant to the manifested temple. Then, foreannouncing the things of his second coming, the word says to the sinners, 'Behold, the Lord Almighty comes, and who shall endure the day of his entrance? Who shall stand in his appearance?'" So here we got a very clear order. The church is completed. The Lord comes to his church, and then judgment is announced. Now, in Irenaeus, there's what I call the post-trib rapture conundrum, because we read in 526:1, "The 10 horns are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but shall receive power as kings for 1 hour with the beast. These have a united purpose and give their strength and power to the beast. And they shall destroy Babylon and burn her with fire and give their kingdom to the beast and persecute the church. And this is why men like Alan Kirshner continually harass me on Twitter and see, you guys are dishonest. Irenaeus was post-trib, and you guys are so blind you can't see it. Well, the fact of the matter is, if you're going to understand somebody's eschatology, you have to understand two things. You have to understand their ecclesiology, and you have to understand their terminology. If you don't, you have no idea what you're reading. Now, let's balance out what we just read with other things that we find in Irenaeus. First of all, his use of the term church. And here, if we put together a summary, what we see in 532:2 and 534:1, we see all the seed of Abraham, both physical and spiritual. This includes the Old Testament saints in the resurrection. It includes the New Testament church age saints, and it includes the tribulation saints, both those that are martyrs and those that are going to, in the flesh, inherit the kingdom. He uses the term church for all of these categories. He doesn't use the church for the Old Testament saints in the Old Testament times, but he does use it for the Old Testament saints in the resurrection. So he's using church in a way that's much more generic than our dispensational understanding of what church means. And I think this is really kind of ironic, because we've got people that are trying to put a dispensational understanding of the term church into Irenaeus so they can prove that Irenaeus was not a dispensationalist. I kind of find that hilarious. He also teaches the pre-tribulation rapture. We read the church is suddenly caught up and then the tribulation in 529:1. And we read that he's going to have a translation to paradise like Enoch, where they're going to stay in heaven until the end of the age, and that's in 551. What we come down to then is Irenaeus, just like dispensationalism in the modern times, has two classes of saints. He's got those that are caught up to paradise prior to the tribulation, and he's got those that are still in the flesh at the second coming who endured the tribulation. So he's got church age believers and he has tribulation believers. And here is where his understanding of the church comes in, because he's using the term church in a way that seems generic to us, it seems foreign to us. The term church in 526:1 must be the tribulation church after the rapture of the church. Anyway, I put that out there for those of you that are patristic scholars or interested in patristic research, and maybe you will investigate this and we can follow up on this subject. My last one from the early fathers is from Macarius, and this is in his Apocriticus. I've taken portions from 425:5 and 412:5. And here we read, "The saying, 'Men shall be raptured to the air at some point,' is rightfully regarded as utter nonsense. The statement that the apostle made about the clouds concerns the angels. The explanation is laid down in the gospel where it says, 'When the Son of Man comes in his glory, he shall send his angels to the four corners of the world and gather his elect from one end of the earth to the other.'" Now this is in the 4th century. He's a Coptic monk from about 300 to 391. So here we're deep into the church age, and he is opposing pre-tribulationism in his day. Notice that the phrase, "the saying," implies that there was common talk and teaching on the pre-tribulation rapture. And he regarded the teaching of the rapture to the air, to stay there, is complete nonsense. And he taught that 1 Thessalonians 4 and the gathering to the clouds was the second coming, when they're going to be gathered and they're just going to be transported to somewhere else on earth. And again, this one deserves to be followed up by folks that are deeper into the church fathers and the research and the patristic pre-tribulation rapture. Well, this brings us to the topic that I was asked to speak on today, which is apostasia in 2 Thessalonians 2:3. Is it the rapture or the apostasy? Now, I think there's a misunderstanding on this controversy because the way people typically explain it to me, they say, well, there's just one pile of evidence, and we've got a teacher over here and a teacher over here, and they're looking at the same pile of evidence, and they're coming to two different conclusions. But I don't think this is actually what's going on. I understand why people think that. The way I understand the situation is that we've got the one presentation is a smaller pile of evidence, and they say that this evidence points to the rapture. And I think there's another much larger pile of evidence, and I think that if you examine this much larger pile of evidence, you're going to be drawn to the conclusion that it points to the apostasy. Now, there's 6 main arguments for the rapture view, and I'm only going to be able to cover 2 of them today. I'm going to cover the meaning argument and the translation argument, and the other 4 arguments, if you're interested, you'll have to pick up a copy of my book. The meaning argument says that apostasia means departure, not apostasy. The translation argument says that early versions in the English Bible all have the word departure, and that this translation stream was first defiled by the King James Bible and the Reims prior to that. The theological argument basically says that the sense of apostasy is theologically impossible. The grammatical argument says the definite article constrains us to be looking at the rapture rather than the apostasy. The exegetical argument says that apostasia in verse 3 is parallel to the removal of the restrainer in verses 6 to 7. And then the contextual argument says that apostasy is not found in the context, and therefore we should be examining the rapture interpretation. Well, I said because of time constraints, I'm only going to cover the first 2. And if you're interested in the other 4 arguments, you'll just have to pick up a copy of my book. So let's look at argument number 1, the meaning argument. And this has a few little points that are made under this argument. We have apostasia doesn't mean apostasy or falling away. It means departure, either abstract or literal. Now, and then it furthers this idea of departure and says apostasia can refer to the physical departure of human beings from point A to point B. And then this meaning argument draws the conclusion that the apostasia in 2 Thessalonians 2:3 is best understood as a physical departure, which would be the rapture of the church leaving earth and going to heaven. Now, there's 3 classes of information that's typically produced to defend the physical departure. And the first one that's pointed out is the second entry in the Liddell and Scott, which gives departure as a meaning for apostasia. Then they have the meaning of the cognate, which is the cognate verb ephistemi. And the claim is made that apostasia is the noun form of the verb ephistemi. And ephistemi is very easily, you can demonstrate that ephistemi is regularly used both in the New Testament and outside the New Testament for physical departure. That's undeniable. And then they point out that another cognate, that both apostasis and apostasia are used for political departure. And if apostasia can mean departure in that sense, it can mean departure in a broader sense, including physical departure. But let's look at the second entry in Liddell and Scott, because I believe that this entry is actually misunderstood. Now, the entry actually says, if you can follow along up there, it says departure, disappearance, Olymp in meta.320.2. If you flesh this out, the title of the work is going to read Olympiadoros in Aristoteles Meteora Commentaria 320.2. If we translate that into English, because it's Latin, it says Olympiadoros in the commentary on Aristotle's meteorology. Now, if we actually dig into what we're looking at here with this entrance, we're going to find out a few things. First of all, we're going to find out that Olympiadoros was a 6th century scientist. He's no longer in the Koine era. He's in the early Byzantine era. And we're going to discover that he wrote commentaries on Aristotle and Plato. And we're going to examine the context of where this citation comes from, and we're going to discover that it's in a scientific context, and the context is talking about the effect of heat and cold on solids and liquids. And apostasia is used here for the evaporation of liquids. And this is a scientific sense that's completely unrelated to the physical departure of human beings from point A to point B. So regardless of the sense, this entry in Liddell and Scott, the second entry, it's several centuries too late to be regarded as throwing light on the New Testament usage. And I would point out, too, that it's not uncommon in the lexicons when they give a reference for a meaning, that reference is often either the first instance that's known in the extant literature for that sense, or if it's an era that's where that sense first came, it's representative of that era. But what's also interesting is if we go and look at the first entry in Liddell and Scott, we see that the first entry says, for its definition, defection and revolt. A legal sense in Dionysius Halicarnassus in Roman Antiquities 7:1, in Josephus's Life in 10, in Plutarch's Lives in his account of Galba 1, and especially in a religious sense, rebelling against God or apostasy, and he lists the Septuagint, Joshua 22:22, and he lists 2 Thessalonians 2:3. So I would point out that defection, revolt, rebellion, apostasy are cited as the first definition. This implies historical precedence. Typically, in lexicons, the first entry is the oldest entry. If you're looking at one of the Hebrew lexicons, sometimes the first entry that's given is a broader Semitic root or an Arabic root. That's assuming that the root came before the second definition. Now, and also this entry here states that the sense of rebellion against God or apostasy was more common than the political sense, and it points to 2 Thessalonians 2:3 for apostasy. So I think there's a little bit of incongruity here in the handling of the definition of apostasy, because if you claim that apostasia means departure, not apostasy, and you point to Liddell and Scott to defend that, it just seems a little incongruous when the first definition is apostasy. That doesn't mean that my view is right. It's just saying there's incongruity, right, in the presentation of the argument. Now, here's also what's very interesting. One of the arguments that's made for apostasia, meaning departure, is people will point to instances of apostasy in both classical and Koine Greek, and then they'll point to apostasia in Koine Greek, where it's obviously used in a sense you can translate departure. It's used in context of political departure. And they're usually translated dissension, sedition, or revolt in the English translations. And this is very common in Koine Greek. Now, they'll take these passages on political departure and they will attempt to piggyback on this and turn it to the advantage of physical departure. But I'm just going to point out here, putting forth examples of apostasis and apostasia used for political departure, which is one party departing from another party, does not prove that they can be used for physical departure, which is a party, an individual, or a party in a collective sense, departing from point A to point B. And I would just point out here, I've looked at every instance of apostasia from its first instance in 250 BC in Archimedes' sand reckoner all the way up to 500 AD. I read all the passages in context in the original, found English translations for them, executed English translations where they were not available, corrected translations where they were miserable. And what we see is apostasia was regularly used for political departure or religious departure. There isn't one extant instance where it was used for physical departure. And I've examined hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of instances of apostasis in Koine and classical Greek, and I have yet to find a single instance where apostasis was used for physical departure. So how about the aphistemi argument, where they say aphistemi is the verb and apostasia is the noun? And they'll point out, and they're right, the apostasy is only used 2 times in the New Testament for departure from the faith. And aphistemi is used 15 times in the New Testament, 3 times for departure from the faith, and 12 times for physical departure. And this is a strong argument in my mind, and it's correct. This is not a misrepresentation. And the conclusion is drawn, if aphistemi is used for physical departure, then apostasia can be used for physical departure too, because apostasia is just a noun. Well, here's the difficulty. The aphistemi argument is what D.A. Carson regards as the root and cognate fallacy. As D.A. Carson comments, one of the most enduring of errors, the root fallacy presupposes that every word actually has a meaning bound up with its shape or its components. This is the root meaning. This root meaning is going to be in the verb. It's going to be in the noun. It's going to be in the adjective. It's going to be in every word derived from it. It has to be consistent with it. I found this in his 1984 Baker edition on page 26. And I've seen regularly, it's a common error to import the meaning of a verb from the New Testament into the noun, or vice versa. Take the meaning of the noun and import it into the verb. A common one that I see on a regular basis is apostolos, or apostle, means sent one, because apostello means to send. But the semantic footprint of the New Testament apostle is much smaller than the semantic footprint of the generic being sent. There was only 12 apostles. They had a very specific calling, very specific task, and very specific gifts. And so you want to be careful to say that to make a generic meaning from the verb and import that into the noun and then import that generic meaning. The cognate fallacy is easily demonstrated from English. We have the verb desert, which means abandon. We have the noun desert, which is a desolate or dry place. We have the noun refuse, which is to decline or reject. We have the noun refuse, which is garbage. We have the verb overlook, which means fail to notice. And we have the noun overlook, which is a vantage point with a great view. So another part that needs to be looked at to understand the difficulties with the cognate fallacy is that if there is a family of verbs and nouns and words in Greek that's the apostasis family. Apostasia belongs to the apostasis family. Now, the apostasis family is a very tight-knit family of cognates that are derived from aphistemi. But it has a semantic range that's significantly smaller than aphistemi. Aphistemi has a very broad semantic footprint. And the apostasis family revolves around rebellion, apostasy, and a handful of well-known scientific senses with the nouns. Those scientific senses are not typically found with the verbs, adjectives, or the adverbs. And this family includes 7 nouns, 1 adjective, 2 verbs, 1 gerund, and 1 adverb. So let's look at the family of nouns. The first one is apostasis, which when it's not used for scientific or technical senses, it means rebellion or apostasy, political rebellion or religious apostasy. Same with apostasia. It has rare scientific or technical senses. When it's not used for those rare scientific or technical senses, it means political rebellion or religious apostasy. The noun apostates, which is where we get the English word apostate, is used for rebels, apostates, deserters, and runaways, including runaway slaves and runaway dogs. Apostation is used exclusively for divorce. There's a separation of 2 parties. Apostatus, which is rare, means sedition or apostasy. It's found only in the Apocrypha and in Cyril of Alexandria. Apostasis is rare. It means rebellion, and it's found only in Xenophon's Cyropedia. And apostases is rebellion and apostasy, and this is the Doric and Aeolic form of apostasis. Now, the other apostasis family words include the adjective apostatikos, which means rebellious. The adverb is apostatikos with the long O, rebelliously. The gerund is apostation, rebelling. A gerund, if you don't know, that's where you have something that looks like a noun, but it's not a noun. It's a verb form that is like running, fishing, hiking, hunting, rebelling. Some languages have their own forms that are only used for a gerund, and it's distinct from the noun. And Greek does that at times. Not real common in the New Testament, but it's definitely common in Koine, very common in Classical. The first verb is apostateo, which means to rebel. And the second verb is apostasiazo, to cause to rebel. Now this raises the question, okay, if apostasia is not the noun form of ephistemi, then what is it? Well, they are cognate. There's not a doubt about it. There's no mistake here. But there are cognates with a very distinct semantic footprint or a very distinct semantic range. Ephistemi is used for a broad range of departure senses, including physical departure. Apostasia is primarily used for political departure, which is usually translated rebellion, sedition, or something of that nature, and for religious departure, which is typically translated apostasy or falling away or something of that nature. Now, apostasia is occasionally used in scientific or technical senses. These are normally covered by apostasis. These are rare senses. And apostasia is never used for physical departure. So what I would like to point out here, just throw it out there for you guys, apostasia is not the noun form of the verb ephistemi. It's related. But if you're going to say that apostasia is the noun form of a verb, you're going to be forced to go to saying that apostasia is the noun form of the verb apostateo, which means to rebel or apostatize, because those two, that combination of noun and verb is much closer than the combination of apostasia with ephistemi. Now, the Koine usage of apostasia is very significant, demands a deep and a broad examination. It first appears in Archimedes' sand reckoner about 250 BC, and I looked at all 283 extant instances all the way up to AD 500. It appears 283 times in the extant literature. Never used a physical departure from point A to point B. It's used one time in Archimedes in the sense of distance, a sense that's normally covered by apostasis. It's used 13 times in Galen in the sense of a medical sense of abscess, which is normally, again, the noun apostasis. It's used 10 times in a legal sense of divorce, which is normally apostation. It's used one time late in the 4th century in the writings of Evagrius in the sense of repentance. And this is very unique because this is the first time apostasia in the extant literature has a positive connotation. It's used 26 times in the sense of political sedition or rebellion, and it's used a whopping 232 times in the sense of religious apostasy. Now, I find the Koine usage of apostasia very significant for the question at hand because we all profess to follow the literal, historical, grammatical hermeneutic, which some people abbreviate to the LHG hermeneutic. Well, what this hermeneutic says about our approach to the Koine language that we see in the Greek New Testament, the understanding is that no New Testament word can bear a sense that's not common in Koine Greek. You're not going to have a word in the Greek New Testament that this meaning here is the first time that meaning appears anywhere in Greek literature. This just doesn't happen. Now, the theologically important words in the New Testament all have elevated senses. They're not distinct senses, but they're elevated senses. We have God-centric rather than man-centric. We have eternal perspective rather than a temporal perspective. We have morality that's derived from God rather than morality that's human-derived. And it has some very elevated senses. For instance, I've read terms of salvation in Josephus where if you were to just sum all these passages together, you could have Titus, when he's around Jerusalem in 70 AD and offering terms of surrender to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And he says, if you will repent and believe and call upon Caesar, you will be saved. The same salvation terms that we have in the New Testament, the same meaning, except that those are mere earthly, temporal, man-centric usages, where in the Bible we have vastly elevated senses for those. So when we come to 2 Thessalonians 2:3, we have several options for the meaning of apostasia. Could it be a rare scientific, medical, or legal sense? And the answer is no. They don't suit the context at all. Can it be the moral sense of repentance? No, that was way too late and it doesn't fit the context. Can it be physical departure? Well, I hate to say it and I hate to be so blunt, but if we're going to look for its being used in Koine Greek, we're forced to say, well, no, because the sense didn't exist. It's not attested anywhere in Koine Greek. And we're left with two choices then. It's either political rebellion or it's apostasy from God. And if we're going to choose between these two senses, it's a simple matter of probability. There's a 90% chance that apostasy is correct over political rebellion, 232 to 26, very close there. And the context would favor apostasy over political rebellion. But there's a further argument that's in favor of apostasia being apostasy rather than physical departure. And that's that apostasia bears an overwhelmingly negative connotation. And this stands in strong contrast to the positive connotation of the rapture. There's only one neutral connotation in all those 283 references, and that was the first one in Archimedes in the Sand Reckoner in 250 BC, where it was used in the sense of distance. Every other instance over 600 years was negative. Abscesses are negative, divorce is negative, rebellion is negative, and apostasy is all negative. But there's still another argument for the connotations that I think stand against the physical departure understanding, and that's that apostasia bears a reflexive connotation. It's separating oneself or your party from that person or that party, and it stands in stark contrast to the passive connotations of the rapture, because in the rapture, we're not going somewhere on our own effort, our own endeavor. The Lord reaches down from heaven and grabs his church and pulls her out of the world. It's a very passive connotation. So these reflexive connotations, an abscess is a sore that's festering and separating itself from healthy tissue. A divorce is a person intentionally and legally separating themselves from their spouse. Rebellion is man separating themselves from their government or from their leadership. And apostasy is men separating themselves from God in walking away from light. Now, there's also one more thing that we need to look at in regards to the meaning of apostasia. And that's that if we're going to talk about root senses, the root sense of apostasia is off-standing, not departure. It's apo, which means off or away, and stasia, which means standing. And the focus of the word is on the fact of there being distance, or the fact of there being an off-standing. It's not talking about the process to get there. It's talking about the fact that that's the state of the situation. So distance is something, how far off something is off-standing. An abscess is an off-standing sore in or on the body. Divorce is a permanent off-standing of one person from another. Political rebellion is off-standing or standing off from your government or from your legal authorities like your military command. And religious apostasy is off-standing or standing off away from God. Now, how then are we going to derive the meaning of apostasia? If we're not going to derive it from the second entry in Little and Scott because it's too late in its unrelated context, and if we're not going to derive it from the semantic footprint of ephistemi because we see that that's the root in cognate fallacy, then where are we going to derive the meaning of apostasia? Well, the only place we can derive it is from its usage in Koine Greek prior to Paul penning the Thessalonian letters. This is just common sense. No rocket science here. This is here in this time we're going to find that it appears 9 times. So it has 1 time it appears in an unrelated scientific sense of distance. 3 times it appears in the sense of religious rebellion or sedition. 3 times we see apostasy used in the Septuagint, which heavily influenced the New Testament. And 2 times it's used of religious apostasy in Jewish literature, which mightily molded the Jewish mind. So let's look at these apostasia usages prior to 2 Thessalonians. In 2 Chronicles 29:19, it's used of Ahaz's apostasy when he sacrificed to the gods of Damascus. In Joshua 22:22, it was used of the feared apostasy of the Transjordanian tribes when they built the altar of witness on the other side of the Jordan. In Jeremiah 2:19, it's used of Israel's apostasy when the nation forsook the Lord for idolatry. And in 1 Maccabees 2:15, it's used of Antiochus Epiphanes when he forced the Jews to sacrifice to Zeus. And in Jubilees, fragment Z, it's used when Nimrod led the world in rebellion, building the Tower of Babel. So I want you to notice that 2 of these usages are of Antiochus Epiphanes and Nimrod, who are both types of the Antichrist. And notice there's a pattern here with idolatry and pagan sacrifice. This isn't talking about some generic sense of apostasy where everyone's morality is sliding. This is apostasy in the sense that we see in the Old Testament and the old Jewish writings where people were sacrificing to false gods, worshiping false gods. So my idea here then is, okay, if this is how apostasy was used prior to the writing of the New Testament, then perhaps apostasia really is apostasy in the sense of departing from the true God to worship a false God. Maybe this is the sense of apostasy after all. Now, sometimes people will say, well, you're going to unrelated Koine context to get your meaning of apostasia. We don't want to go to unrelated context. And I can't say there's nothing in this argument. I mean, it's a legitimate concern. However, if we insist that we can't get the meaning of apostasia from the Koine usage of apostasia, and we insist that we need to get it only from the meaning of 2 Thessalonians 2:3 in its immediate context, then we should see some consistency in this regard. But there is inconsistency here, because the folks that will claim that these other Koine passages are unrelated context, they'll often themselves cite unrelated context in Little and Scott. They'll appeal to unrelated context with ephistemi, which is actually a different word altogether. And they will appeal to political departure uses of apostasia to infer physical departure. So no matter which side of this aisle you're looking at and which you favor, you're going to find people looking outside the New Testament to defend the definition of koine, of apostasia in Koine Greek. And that's not necessarily wrong. That really is how we ought to be doing things. Now, got a little cartoon up here. I'm going to use a little illustration. It's called Unrelated Bulldogs. And you see this little guy with this little poodle-looking thing, and he says, "Don't judge my bulldog by unrelated bulldogs. We want to judge my bulldog on its own merits." And this guy, he goes to the experts and he says, "Hey, I think that this is a bulldog." And the experts say, "No, that's not a bulldog. That puffball is not a bulldog. This is what bulldogs look like." Well, I think we're doing a very similar thing when we come to apostasia, because if you say you can't look to the Koine usage to determine the meaning of apostasia, and you want to judge apostasia only by its context, then you're really throwing out the scientific approach to determine the meaning of a word. You have to determine the available senses from outside the New Testament, and then in the New Testament determine which of those senses best fits the context. But here we have, "Don't judge my apostasia by unrelated apostasias," and the answer is, that little puffball is not apostasia. This is what apostasias look like. So, let's move on to argument number 2, which is the translation argument. In a nutshell, this says all the early translations feature departure. And we'll start with the Greek. The argument is often made, the Greek words apostasia, departure, and ekpipto, falling away, are distinct concepts with no overlap. And departure is the only correct translation of apostasia. translating apostasia by apostasy or falling away is wrong. And then the argument continues. The early translations translated apostasia by departure, and the translators intended to convey physical departure. The long history of this departure translation tradition was first polluted by the Catholic Church with the Reims version in 1582 when they introduced revolt. And the King James Bible, sadly, was the first Protestant Bible to embrace the Catholic pollution with the erroneous translation of falling away. And then Beza further fueled the translation fiasco by transliterating apostasia rather than translating it, and introduced the English word apostasy. Now, it's also strengthened with the argument that translating apostasy by departure is an ancient translation that goes all the way back to Jerome's Latin Vulgate, which featured the rendering discessio. And when you look at this at first glance, if this argument is true, this is a slam dunk, right? If it's true. But here's the problem. This whole translation argument is a mirage. The argument looks good at first glance. It's convinced many people to move off what I would regard as the beaten path for where the church has been for centuries. And every point of the argument is false. Not one point is true. Let's look first of all at apostasy and ekpipto as they're used in Koine Greek. Cyril of Alexandria in his commentary on the 12 prophets commenting on Hosea 6:7. Since, like the first man, Adam that is, they slipped into apostasy, they too will be completely fallen away from the one able to bless them. Procopius of Gaza, in his commentary on Isaiah, which you find in Mean, volume 87, point 2, or concerning those who have truly fallen from life, the demons, for example, through their apostasy. And Eusebius in his commentary on Psalms 18:17, which if you're reading the Septuagint will be 17:18. When I was enduring a great fall, lest after my sin I fall away into absolute apostasy, he offered to support me. So you see in these three passages here that apostasia, apostasy, and ekpipto, falling away, are synonyms. And the fact is, if you go through these passages, you could do this anywhere in the early church fathers. You can do it anywhere this appears in Koine Greek. You can switch these two terms out, and the passage is going to give you the same thought. You could go, for example, with Procopius's passage and say, or concerning those who have apostatized from life, the demons, for example, through their falling away. It doesn't change the meaning at all. It changes the nuance in a minor way, but doesn't change the significance. So falling away is definitely a paraphrastic or a paraphrasing translation of apostasia, but it is not inaccurate. Now, when we move on to the list of the English versions that are typically listed, we have the list of versions that are cited for all the early English versions is Wycliffe 1384, Tyndale 1526, Coverdale 1535, Cranmer 1539, Britches 1576, Beza 1583, and Geneva 1608. But this list actually contains some egregious errors and some misleading information. For instance, the Britches Bible is not an independent translation. It's just the Geneva Bible. It's a nickname for the Geneva Bible. The Beza Bible is just the Geneva New Testament with Beza's notes. It's not an independent translation. And Wycliffe does not belong on this list. Now, so ultimately now this list only has 4 of the early major English versions. Let's look at Wycliffe's testimony, because Wycliffe is wrongly claimed for a departure-only reading. Wycliffe in 1380 featured 4 but dissension come first. Wycliffe in 1382 had for no but departing away or dissension shall come first. And Wycliffe in 1388 had for but dissension come first. So dissension is the oldest and the most common reading in the Wycliffe manuscripts. In fact, the 1382 text treats departing away and dissension as synonyms. What's interesting here is if we go and we look up the word dissension in the Oxford English Dictionary, we find that it equals modern English dissension or disagreement, and it means that it produces strife or contention. Now, where did I go for my Wycliffe sources? I went to the English Hexapla, 1841, which uses a very ancient Wycliffe manuscript compared to other manuscripts. And I went to Forshaw and Madden's Wycliffe Bible, the Oxford edition, 1850, which has an earlier version and a later version. And they're both from multiple manuscripts compared with multiple manuscripts. Now, there's also a non-departure reading that's prior to Wycliffe, believe it or not. In the Cursor Mundi, which is the Runner of the World, published around 1300, we read, "First there shall be dissension ere, that is, before the Antichrist shall come." The Cursor Mundi was a poem of nearly 30,000 lines that told the history of redemption from creation to the day of judgment. So you can see that the translation dissension for this passage of Scripture existed in English nearly a century before Wycliffe's translation was departed. But another thing that we should consider is, what is the definition of of departure in Middle English? Well, Middle English ranged from 1100 to 1500 AD. The Concise English Dictionary the Concise Dictionary of Middle English says division. The Oxford English Dictionary says that departure meant separation, severance, or parting. And it noted that this sense was obsolete at the time the Oxford English Dictionary was published in the late 1800s. And the Online Etymological Dictionary says that departure means going away, deviation, or turning away. So if you'll notice, all these ancient sources for the meaning of departure in Middle English tell us that the most common Middle English sense was a breach of a relationship. In other words, we got the rebellion or dissension. We have apostasy or departure in a religious sense. And this sense of the breach of relationship endured deep into the 1600s. But we also have more testimony here that these translators, the early English Bibles, did not mean physical departure. They intended to convey the sense of religious departure. For instance, the Geneva Bible, 1560 and 1569, in the introduction to 2 Thessalonians says, "Before that day there should be a falling away from true religion, even by a great part of the world." Proof that falling away and departure were regarded by them as synonyms. And it's proof that the translators and editors of the Geneva Bible intended to convey the sense of falling away or departure, falling away or apostasy when they used the word departure. But we can also look at the prefaces to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 in these early versions. The Matthews in 1537, the Great Bible in 1540, the Tyndale Matthews in 1551, the Geneva in 1557, 1560, 1569, and the Bishop's Bible in 1568 say, "The day of the Lord shall not come till the departing from the faith come first." If we look at the Geneva Thompson, 1595, which is also known as the Beza New Testament, we read, "The day of the Lord shall not come till there come a departure from the faith." So again, we have proof that they looked at falling away and departure as synonyms. They were using them interchangeably. And we have proof that the translators and editors were intending to convey the idea of falling away or apostasy when they employed the word departure. But there's still more testimony here. If we look at the marginal notes in these early English Bibles, we will discover that Coverdale 1535 and 1553 and the bishops in 1568 referenced the phrase "departing come first" with Daniel 9e, which is equivalent to modern Daniel 9:25 through 27, where we read the account of the Antichrist. And he also associated it with 1 Timothy 4a, which is equivalent to Timothy 4:1 through 6, where we read, "In the last days some shall depart from the faith." So they were associating the apostasy with the Antichrist and the falling away from the faith. We see the similar thing with the Cranmers in 1540, which is also known as the Great Bible. We see Tyndale Matthews in 1551. They're alluding to the passage in Daniel which presents the Antichrist. And in the Geneva Thompson 1595, which is the Beza Bible, we have a note in the column or in the margin that says that wicked man shall sit and many shall fall away from God to him. But let's add the German versions to this mix. If we look at the Mentel Bible, and there were 20 editions from 1466 to 1518, we read, "Wann es kommt zum ersten Misshellung, unless the dissension come first." Misshellung is equivalent to modern Misshelligkeit, which is disagreement or dissension. And mishelling was used in the Middle Ages in the sense of revolt, particularly in literature that was referring to the peasant uprisings which occurred throughout the Middle Ages. But we can look at German versions like Luther. Luther Bible in 1529 said, "Denn kommt nicht, es sei denn, dass zuvor der Abfall komme. For that day shall not come unless the falling away come before." Upfall means falling off, falling away, defection, secession, revolt, or rebellion. And the fact of the matter is, Luther is probably the true source of the English reading falling away in the King James Bible. But there's even an earlier version in German. We can go all the way back to Wulfela, which is also known as the Gothic Bible. This was about 350 AD, and there we read, "Unter niva kimeth afstas forthis." A rough literal translation is, "Until except come turning away before." A comparative grammar of the glossary of the Gothic language says afstas means standing off, or falling away. So we have Wulfela giving us a turning away or a falling away that preceded Jerome's Latin Vulgate by 50 years. But if we turn to the Latin lexicons on discessio, we also find some interesting information. Castle's Latin dictionary says it means going separate ways, separation, division, going away, departure. Lewis and Short tell us it means going away or departure, and then it gives us two senses of going away or departure. It gives us sense A, which it says very rarely in general. And then the second one, in particular, political division or separation and schism in the church. And then it lists 2 Thessalonians 2:3. The Oxford Latin Dictionary gives us going away, withdrawal, division, schism, or separation. So if we conclude, just looking at these Latin lexicons, we see that the sense of physical departure was rare, and the sense of political or religious departure was common. But thankfully, we don't have to start weighing Latin lexicon entries to decide what Jerome meant when he translated apostasia by discessio, because he tells us in his own writings. In his collected letters, number 121, which is the letter to Algasium, Jerome says, answering a question on 2 Thessalonians 2:3, "For he, Paul, says that unless the dissension, that is the discessio, which is called apostasia, comes first, so that all the nations who are subject to Roman authority withdraw from them, and he will be revealed, that is manifested, whom all the words of the prophets announced beforehand, the man of sin." In Jerome's mind, apostasia and discessio signified a dissension in the Roman Empire that would see the subject nations withdraw from Rome. Now, what you have to understand if you're going to understand this passage is that Jerome, like many of the early fathers, held that Rome was the restrainer. And Rome fracturing was the restrainer being removed, and after that removal, the Antichrist would be revealed. And by the way, just a little footnote here, all the early church fathers, all of them, either held that this was a political rebellion or sedition, or religious rebellion or apostasy. There was no other options. They all taught one of those two. They never opposed a physical departure position. They never mentioned a physical departure position as an option. And to move on here now, the King James Version was not the first Protestant non-departure reading. The Bishop's Bible in 1568 said, "Except there come a falling away first." And the Bishop's Bible was the Bible that was the foundation Bible, or the basis Bible for the King James Version. The Geneva Bible in 1560 and 1569 used the phrase falling away as an explanation for apostasia in their introduction. The Geneva Thompson in 1595, also known as the Beza Bible, explained apostasia by many falling away from God to the Antichrist in a footnote. Calvin, in his commentary in Thessalonians in 1550, says the day of Christ will not come until the world has fallen into apostasy. And the Luther Bible in 1529, as we saw, reads, "Es sei denn, das zuvor der Abfall komme," that is, unless the falling away come before. Now let's move on to Beza, because Beza is often introduced into this conversation as if he's played a significant part in defiling the translation chain. But if we look at Beza's translation work, first of all, Beza did not do an English translation. The Beza Bible is a Geneva Bible with his notes translated into English. His Latin translation, which appeared in 5 major editions, features defectio, doesn't feature apostasia. His Latin notes don't offer apostasia as a transliteration or a translation. And his hand in the revision of Olivetan's French version, where departement was changed to revolt. Again, revolt is not introducing the word apostasia or the transliteration apostasy. Now, furthermore, it's actually impossible that Beza was the source of the transliteration apostasia or the English word apostasy. And the reason for this is the French word for apostasy is attested as early as 1305. The apostasy is attested in Wycliffe and Purvey in the 1300s. Apostasia was attested in Latin in the 4th century. That's the 300s. So in all 3 of these languages of which we're concerned with, apostasia was represented in those languages by transliteration long before Beza appeared on the scene. So what was Beza's role in this whole thing? Beza is not the source of the word apostasy. He's not the source of the transliteration apostasia, and he's not the source of the concept of apostasy as opposed to departure. He's simply the leader in non-departure, that is, non-dissension translations. Remember that departure meant dissension in Old English, and it meant that until well into the 1600s. So, then why was the word departure replaced in the English translations? Well, first of all, the meaning of departure had shifted from dissension to physical departure, making it an ambiguous translation at best. And 2, the Reformation attention to the Scriptures had determined that the term dissension was not strong enough to convey the sense of the rebellion against God that's seen in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Headed up by the Antichrist. And so they turned to terms like revolt, rebellion, and apostasy to convey the magnitude and the bold-faced wickedness of the end times departure from God. So in a conclusion on this little section here, let me point out, folks, and I hate to be blunt, but I can't think of any other way to say it. I'm just a blunt guy, so you'll have to forgive me. There never was a physical departure translation tradition. It never existed. Never existed. Non-departure translations date back to 1300 in English. Departure in the early English versions meant dissension and falling away. Jerome meant rebellion with the translation discessio. And the German had falling away and turning away readings all the way back to 350 AD. So departure in the English versions is just a subset of the apostasy rebellion tradition, but it's a strengthening of that translation tradition. And as I mentioned earlier before, if physical departure is a legitimate sense of the Greek word apostasia, it would stand to reason that that sense would have come up in the early church fathers in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 or somewhere else where this word is used. But if you go through all the passages in the early church fathers where the word apostasy is mentioned, you will discover that no father taught physical departure, no father opposed physical departure, no father even mentioned the possibility of physical departure in this passage or any other place that they touched on the word apostasia. The early church fathers universally understood and taught either political rebellion or religious apostasy, and they always associated, whether the political rebellion or the apostasy, they associated it with the Antichrist. Well, that's a wrap for my presentation. I just got 2 little points I want to bring up here, and we're going to be closed. When it comes to investigation methodology, we have sola scriptura is the heart cry of the Reformation. And if this isn't your heart cry, it ought to be. It really ought to be. But we need to add a vital corollary to this vital investigation principle. I like to say we want sola facta et omnia facta. In other words, in English, we want only the facts and all the facts. Because partial investigation undermines objective investigation. And I'm not going to be pointing fingers here at anybody. I've been guilty of this in my past. There's not a man in this room that hasn't been guilty of doing a smaller research in an area where we should have been doing much vaster research. We've all done it. No man has time to master every subject and to investigate every question. We just don't. We all fall back in shortcuts, and we trust men that we trust, and we trust them for good reasons. But none of us is perfect. So as Sherlock Holmes says, it is a capital mistake to theorize before you have all the evidence. So in conclusion, we've only covered 2 of my 6 arguments that address the meaning of apostasia in 2 Thessalonians 2:3. We examined the meaning argument. We saw that apostasia never meant physical departure in Koine Greek. And we saw that apostasia, when it was not used of technical senses, was used for religious apostasy or political rebellion. And we examined the translation argument, and we saw that there never was a tradition of physical departure, translation. The only tradition was apostasy or rebellion. And the departure is a subset of the rebellion, apostasy, translation. Now, in my mind, these 2 arguments alone sink the understanding that it's a physical departure in 2 Thessalonians 2:3. But there's 4 other arguments, and I don't have time to present them today. But if you're interested, the books are available out there on my table. If the table runs out, you can order them on Amazon. So that's my presentation today, and I thank you for patiently listening to me.
Thank you, Lee. Could you run through, starting in 2 Thessalonians 2:1, through that passage up there and give us your basic understanding
Sure.
of that section there?
Okay, when I look at this passage here in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, we've got to understand that the context, starting in chapter 1, is the day of the Lord. And I think there's pretty much a strong agreement that that would be the context. And then when you follow from verse 4 on, we see the day of the Lord in the sense of the dawning of the day of the Lord, because it brings out all the workings of the Antichrist. So chapter 1 is the arrival of the day of the Lord, when God is going to bring judgment on the earth. Yeah, the dawning of the day of the Lord would be the tribulation. The arrival of the day of the Lord, it would be the second coming. Now, the promise that we see held out, not just in this passage, but all over in Paul's epistles, is the church is not going to go through the day of the Lord. We're not going to go, not only are we not going to see the dawning of that day where the sun rises in burning heat and completely destroys the world, we're not going to even see any of the dawning of that day where the judgment starts small and get deeper and deeper and deeper, like the flood waters in the flood got deeper and deeper on the globe. We're not going to see it. Now, I look at verse 1 here. It says, "And now we beseech you, brethren, by the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and by our gathering together unto him." Some of the modern versions, I think, miss the mark on the translation. They say they have regarding or concerning, and they miss the fact that this is just a plain vanilla request formula in Koine Greek. And request formulas they have 3 parts that are possible. You don't always see all 3, but there is the verb itself, a verb of asking or requesting. There is the request itself, which can be an infinitive, can be a participle, can be a direct object. There's different ways you can manifest this. And then they have the optional huper clause, which gives the ground or the reason for the request. And what he's basically saying here, to paraphrase it, "Now we beseech you, brother, because of the rapture, not to worry about the day of the Lord." So he's contrasting the rapture and the day of the Lord.
So do you see Granville Sharp there in verse 1?
No.
So, I don't either. I was just saying,
Yeah,
some
no.
people say it's a Granville Sharp rule.
Yeah, the Granville Sharp rules, boy, it's like the redheaded stepchild. It gets beaten up all the time.
Right. Well, so do you see both of those terms referring to the same event, in spite of the Granville Sharp?
Yeah, absolutely. The coming of our Lord here is touching on the rapture, and the gathering together unto him is touching on the rapture. So as I go through this passage, then I see the context, the day of the Lord, and Paul is saying, listen, folks, you're going to go up. You are not going through. That's how I understand it.
Thank you. Thank you. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I am not a Greek scholar, but I wondered about something. You said that there was a lot of usage in those days.
Yeah.
And Paul certainly knew all those usages,
Yep.
for rebellion, divorcing, hiking, and dissension, and things like that. What if, is it possible that Paul used the term in a negative sense, and that it was a rebellion against Satan and a divorcing from Satan's kingdom, a hiking up to conquer Satan's kingdom, and a rising up of a rebellion against Satan as we leave the earth?
Well, that argument, if a person's going to go on that path, that would be much harder to answer. I have a dear friend here, Tyler's in the audience. He's presented a similar position, and that's a little harder to answer than the physical departure answer.
I mean, he may have meant it sarcastically. I don't know. I'm asking a question.
Yeah,
I really don't know Greek.
I'm not inclined there myself simply because I don't see that usage in Koine Greek. That's what I would say.
Which is about sequence. It's really important to have specific matters for sequence. This is why the rapture view has been so helpful in the exegesis of the passage, because you get an event, you get something.
Right.
So, hey, apostasia is articular, trying to find in context what that could refer to. What's your take specifically? If it's not departure, if it's revolt or falling away from the faith or something, in Paul's day in the first century, early on in his epistles, what would that, we don't even have a Christian movement really going yet. What's he talking about? What's he prophesying?
Well, if you're going to use the definite article with apostasy, the only place we could possibly go is the prophesied apostasy in the last days under the Antichrist, where the whole world doesn't just walk away from their Christian morality. The whole world is going to be brought into a very religious form of atheism, a very militant form of atheism. So that's where I would take it. Just walking away from all known light.
Isn't the sign or the revelation the Antichrist himself, after the departure? Or after the apostasy?
Oh, if you're looking at an order here,
there's a sequence issue.
Yeah, no, if that's the sequence you're talking about, no, I don't see any sequence at all between the coming and our gathering together unto him. The early church fathers didn't see the sequence either, and I assume that they would know Koine Greek a little better than we did. So how I would take that is, for instance, if I told my son, I want you to take out the trash and rake the grass, or we're not going camping. There's not necessarily any order there. I don't care if he rakes the grass first and then takes out the trash, or he takes out the trash and rakes the grass, but those two things are together, and that's how the early church fathers looked at them. That's how I look at them. The apostasy and the Antichrist can't be separated.
Okay, thank you.
What about the fact that Acts 21:21, the other time the noun is used, it's anarthrous, but you have the article here.
Yep.
So there he's clearly referring to...
More of a generic.
Right.
Yep.
But explain the significance of the article.
Okay, the significance for me is he definitely has a instance of apostasy in mind, the apostasy at the end of the age in association with the Antichrist. That's how I would take it.
For your presentation. As I'm sure you've experienced this, anytime that I have brought up the fact that I believed in a pre-trib rapture with somebody who didn't accept that, this is the go-to verse. And so I just wanted to ask you to explain your view as you would explain it to, say, a person who used this verse to support the post-trib view.
Yeah, the typical view that's favored by the post-trib camp and the pre-wrath rapture camp is that the coming of our Lord Jesus and our gathering together, which we understand as a rapture, they equate that with the day of the Lord. So these two are the same things. And so therefore, we're not going to see the rapture until we see the Antichrist and the apostasy. Well, I say no. If you look at here, the King James says, we beseech you by, and as Brother Andy said earlier, he liked the King James Version in some places, but he wasn't King James only. That's exactly how I feel. This passage here, the King James, is an accurate translation. It presents the contrast between the rapture phrases and the following day of the Lord, because he's saying, I beseech you by the rapture, or because of the rapture, not to worry about the day of the Lord. Andy.
Yeah, thanks for all your study on that. I'm just trying to get some clarity because I understand what you're against. I'm trying to figure out what you're for here. Help me with this. You reject the physical departure. So you're taking
I
this-
reject the physical departure interpretation of apostasia,
Right.
But I do believe that we're going to go up in a physical departure.
Yeah, no, I get that. I get all that. But this term apostasy here, who's, if it's doctrinal, who's departing? It's the unbelieving world departing? It's the world?
This would be the world in general, no matter how much light they started with.
Okay.
It'd be the Jews, the Gentiles, the professing church. Everyone's walking away from the light they had to embrace pitch black darkness.
Okay, so this is post-rapture, this apostasy.
Yes.
In your view. And basically your view is it's the unbelievers departing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's where a lot of the struggle is.
Yeah.
Because my understanding of apostasy is it's a departure from known truth. I mean, unbelievers can't get any further away from the truth than they already are. You know, how does an unbeliever depart from the truth?
And actually, I would look at the exact opposite, because I do not believe a believer can apostatize from the faith. We cannot lose our salvation. We can get messed up in our doctrine, and I think we're seeing that in the last days. Every one of you with discernment can see areas where you're just scratching your head. But the apostasy is unbelievers walking away from the opportunity to be saved, embracing absolute darkness. I think it's the sin of committing the unpardonable sin. It's the sin of the Pharisees. So that's how I would take it.
Okay, so it's those in darkness walking into further darkness? Is that what your view is?
Well, darkness you cannot be recovered from.
Okay.
Becoming an apostate.
Okay, so
Yeah.
you're taking those that do this can't be saved in the tribulation.
Yeah, once they've gone down this path, no, they're gone.
Well, that helps me at least understand your...
Yeah. No, great question. Great
You
questions.
did a great job explaining what you're against. I was just trying to figure out what you're for.
Yeah, no.
There are 7 major passages in the New Testament teaching apostasy.
Yes.
One is in James, the oldest book,
Yep.
first book of the New
I'm
Testament.
glad you said James is the oldest book of the New Testament.
Right. Well, that's my understanding.
Mine too.
And then the other 6 come from the pastoral epistles and 1st and 2nd Peter.
Right.
And those are, and these guys are about to go away.
Yep.
And so they're very concerned about the church departing from the faith.
Yep.
So how would you, and apostasy, the noun is used like in 2 Timothy 4:1 or something like that, I believe. How would you handle the idea that early on the apostles did not write about apostasy, unless this is the exception, because probably 1 Thessalonians is the second book that Paul wrote, and third book that he wrote, 1 Thessalonians and then 2 Thessalonians. And the idea of apostasy, as is emphasized in the later epistles, is not emphasized in the earlier epistles. What's your interaction on that?
I would say that they were heavily leaning early in the writing of the New Testament book era on the same thing they were leaning on prior to the writing of the New Testament books, was on the Old Testament scriptures and the time that's regarded there, the time of Jacob's trouble, the time of the Antichrist, the time of that you see there. That's what they're referring to.
Okay, so could it be that since he's laying out a framework for the end times in 2 Thessalonians,
Yep.
that's part of it? In other words, that's why he brings it up. If your view is correct.
Yeah, I would think so. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Good morning. So you said you made a statement that you didn't believe that anyone who is saved could be apostate.
Yeah.
Right? That they couldn't depart from the faith.
Yeah.
And so my question to you are: what about people who claim to be in the faith, that have made a profession of faith, and they're in same-sex marriages, they're pro-pedophilia, they're pro-social justice? How do you go when they go from the message of the gospel that there's neither Jew nor Greek, no slave nor free, but they've actually separated themselves from the gospel, but they claim to be the gospel, and these churches have sprouted up everywhere. How do you reconcile that?
No, well, we all see that. It's an awful apostasy in our day. How I understand that is, years ago, a dear brother, Reformed Baptist preacher, told me, if you can fall away, you will fall away. If you don't have the regeneration power of the Holy Spirit in you, helping you to walk in holiness, you cannot, on a continuous basis, resist the wiles of the devil. You will fall away. And I think this is what's happened. We have a whole slew of people, 40 and under, who have gave lip service to the gospel, the mental assent to the gospel. They were never born again and indwelt by the Holy Spirit.
Fair enough.
Okay, another one? Great. Come on up. Come on down.
Mr. Brainard, thank you for your presentation. It was very clear. And my question is more regarding how can the regular layperson protect themselves if they're reading we all use different versions of the Bible. How can they protect themselves from, how do you say? Yeah, they're reading a translation, but then it's mistranslated. What would you recommend?
I say that everyone should have their favorite literal translation that they use for their main study Bible, but use 2 or 3 other literal English translations. And if French is your main language, have a couple French translations, or German or Spanish. Nobody has to know Greek or Hebrew to come to sound doctrine. The advantage of Greek and Hebrew is you can have a more sophisticated defense against sophisticated error. But your average error, your average misunderstandings, anyone that loves the Bible and studies it in their mother tongue and uses a couple of versions, they're going to come out real strong.
I use Texas English version. But that's why we have pastor teachers in the church.
Yeah.
They're supposed to protect the flock and
Amen.
teach the flock, and they should have training, and stuff. So I know you would agree with that.